Front office executives sitting across the table from their own head coach, expecting him to fall in line on a quarterback decision that had already been made for him somewhere upstairs, and instead getting a flat one-word refusal. That's the scene sitting underneath everything happening in Cleveland right now, and once you understand what that refusal actually meant, the whole situation looks completely different. Todd Monken didn't just decline to bench Shedeur Sanders. He declined to be managed. He declined to let people who don't coach football tell him how to run his quarterback room. And when a head coach draws that line in a building with Cleveland's recent history, it isn't a footnote. It's a signal flare. Because think about what it actually requires for a coach to have to push back on his own front office just to give a young quarterback a fair, honest competition for the job. That's not how healthy organizations operate. Healthy organizations let the coach coach. What Monken's defiance exposed is a front office that had already decided how this story was supposed to end, and a coach who wasn't willing to write that ending for them. Word travels fast inside a building like that, and it travels even faster once a decision like this one gets made. Coordinators hear about it. Position coaches hear about it. Players hear about it, whether anyone officially confirms a thing or not. And once the room understands that the head coach is willing to absorb heat from ownership and the front office rather than cave on a personnel decision, that changes how every single person in that facility operates going forward. It's one thing to talk about accountability in a press conference. It's another thing entirely to watch it get demonstrated at the highest level of the organization, in real time, with real consequences attached. So he made it real. Not a symbolic rep here or there to check a box, not a competition designed to look fair on paper while everyone already knows the outcome. An actual battle for the job. And the fact that this required him to stand his ground tells you something important about what Shedeur Sanders has been dealing with since the day he walked into that building. This wasn't a young quarterback getting a normal, developmental runway. This was a young quarterback trying to earn a job inside an organization where certain people had already decided he wasn't going to get one, regardless of what he showed on the practice field. That didn't happen by accident either. Go back and trace how the story around Shedeur actually got built. It wasn't one bad take that spiraled. It was constructed, piece by piece, over months, until doubting him started to feel like common sense instead of an opinion. The foundation was technical. He can't process coverage fast enough. He doesn't see the field the way an NFL starter needs to. His football IQ isn't where it needs to be. And once that idea got repeated enough times, by enough voices, in enough overlapping conversations, it stopped sounding like speculation and started sounding like fact nobody needed to question anymore. Here's what almost nobody stopped to ask while that was happening. Who exactly was making these claims, and what gave them the authority to make them? Because when you actually look at the loudest critics, the ones most confident in diagnosing Shedeur's ability to read a defense, you find a group of people who have never taken an NFL snap, not one. These are commentators and media personalities whose football experience comes from a broadcast booth or a press box, making hard technical judgments about quarterback processing speed based on impressions, not film study, not access, not experience actually playing the position at the highest level. For a while, nobody with real credibility stepped in to challenge that. And then somebody did, and the entire thing started to wobble. Jalen Ramsey doesn't ask permission before he says what he sees. This is a player with Super Bowl hardware, multiple All-Pro selections, a career built on lining up across from the best quarterbacks alive and reading exactly what they're doing before they do it. So when a player with that resume decides to weigh in, you listen, because he has actually earned the right to have an opinion that matters. What he said wasn't complicated or dramatic. He said Shedeur reads coverage well. That's the whole statement. Short, direct, no hedging. And it detonated the narrative that had taken months to build. Because one sentence from a future Hall of Famer who has spent his career picking apart quarterbacks from the other side of the ball carried more weight than every hot take combined. Ramsey knows exactly what it looks like when a quarterback can't process a defense. He's made a living exploiting quarterbacks who can't. And he looked at Shedeur and said, that's not what he's seeing. The people who never wore pads got publicly contradicted by someone who spent a career wearing them, and there's no follow-up segment that closes that credibility gap. There's also a leverage shift buried inside all of this that doesn't get talked about enough. Every quarterback competition has winners and losers beyond just the two players on the depth chart. When a front office is quietly steering the outcome, the backup quarterback holds artificial leverage, propped up by people pulling strings behind the scenes instead of earned through performance. The moment Monken made the competition genuine, that artificial leverage evaporated. Suddenly, nothing is guaranteed to anybody based on draft status, based on comfort level in meetings, based on whatever relationships exist upstairs. It has to be earned on the practice field, in front of the entire roster, where hiding is not an option. That shift alone should terrify anyone who was relying on the previous arrangement to protect their job security. So watch what happened next, because the pattern says more than any single claim ever could. Once the coverage reading argument collapsed under Ramsey's comments, the attack didn't disappear. It relocated. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about football IQ anymore, it was about leadership. He can't hold a locker room. He doesn't have the presence veteran players respect. He's too young, too unproven in the areas that live outside the playbook. Again, no named sources. No players going on record with complaints. No actual evidence, just repetition until it accumulated the illusion of truth through sheer volume. And again, reality didn't cooperate. The locker room Monken was building didn't look like one in revolt. It looked disciplined, focused, and functional. So that story started cracking too. And that's when the target changed completely. Forget Shedeur for a minute. Suddenly the conversation became about whether Todd Monken himself could survive the season. One spring. That's the entire sample size some people needed before floating the idea that a coach who walked into one of the most dysfunctional situations in the league might not make it to year 2. Stop and actually sit with what that tells you about the real motivation behind these conversations. This was never about wins and losses. It was about protecting a conclusion that had already been decided before the season even started, and every time reality pushed back against that conclusion, the target simply moved somewhere new. That's not how honest football analysis works. That's what agenda-driven narrative protection looks like when it gets caught flat-footed. Before anyone judges Monken against some invisible Cleveland standard, it's worth actually looking at what that standard has historically been. Kevin Stefanski spent years running that building. 8 wins across 2 full seasons at the low point. 8. That number should be uncomfortable for everyone who had a hand in that stretch, front office included, because 8 wins in 2 years isn't a rough patch, it's a structural collapse. And yet Stefanski got patience. He got the benefit of the doubt, extension after extension, without anywhere near this level of scrutiny attached to it. Nobody was drafting stories about his job security after one offseason. He got the basic professional courtesy of being allowed to actually coach before anyone started measuring him for a coffin. Monken walked into the wreckage Stefanski left behind, immediately built a program with visible structure and standards, and is already facing survival-level questions before he's coached a single regular season snap in Cleveland. That gap in patience isn't subtle, it's glaring. Around the league, other coaching staffs notice these things too. Nobody wants to walk into a building where the front office is actively working against the head coach's evaluation of his own roster. That kind of dysfunction gets discussed quietly among agents, among front office circles, among coaches who've heard the stories from people who work there. A franchise's reputation inside the league matters when it comes to recruiting free agents, retaining assistant coaches, and convincing good coordinators to take a job there instead of somewhere else. Every public example of Cleveland eating its own only reinforces a perception the organization has spent years trying to shake, and Monken refusing to play along is one of the first real signs that something inside that building is actually trying to change. And then there's the Freddie Kitchens comparison, which gets thrown around casually and deserves to be shut down directly because it's lazy even by the standards of a city that has produced plenty of lazy takes. Kitchens' Cleveland tenure was chaos you could see with your own eyes almost immediately. Disorganized practices, reactive game plans instead of intentional ones, inconsistent accountability that showed up in ugly ways every Sunday. It felt improvised from week one, like a staff hoping the roster's talent would cover for a lack of structure underneath it. Monken is the opposite of that in every way that actually matters. From his first days on the practice field, the standard was obvious. Reps got stopped and corrected in real time when the execution wasn't right. Accountability wasn't something discussed in a press conference, it was enforced on the grass, which is the only place it actually counts. Anyone who watched this spring closely could see a coach building a program, not just managing whatever roster he inherited. And it's worth remembering what Monken actually did in Baltimore before this job. His offensive design there was genuinely difficult to defend, creative, layered, built to stress a defense in multiple directions at once. He didn't have the personnel in Cleveland this spring to fully unlock that version of himself, but that's a roster limitation, not a coaching one. He's shown, on tape, in a different building, that when the pieces are actually there, he can build an offense that competes with the best defenses in the league. He inherited a talent gap that took years to create and is being judged on an accelerated timeline as if he walked into a fully stocked roster instead of a rebuild. That's not a fair evaluation. That's a setup dressed up as accountability. Now, about the improvement everyone keeps referencing when they talk about Cleveland's trajectory this year. It isn't optimism. It's arithmetic. A team that won 8 games across 2 seasons has almost nowhere to go but up with even league-average quarterback play. That's not a bold prediction, that's just how records work when the floor was that low. But the number itself isn't the real story here, and framing it that way misses what's actually different. What genuinely changes the equation is Shedeur finally getting an honest opportunity inside a real system, with a coaching staff actually building around what he does well, instead of a situation engineered to justify moving on from him. That environment simply didn't exist for him in Cleveland before this. And anyone who's paid attention to quarterback development over the years knows the surrounding structure matters almost as much as the raw talent. A young quarterback developing inside a staff that believes in him looks completely different from one being quietly undermined by people hoping he fails. There's a human element to all of this that tends to get lost when the conversation stays purely tactical. Shedeur Sanders has spent his entire life being evaluated, questioned, compared, and doubted, going back long before he ever put on a Browns uniform. That kind of scrutiny either breaks a young player or it sharpens him, and everything coming out of that building this spring suggests it's done the latter. A quarterback who has already survived a public campaign built specifically to discredit him before he took a single regular season snap is not walking into week 1 fragile. If anything, he's walking in with something to prove to people who spent months insisting he never would. The real measuring stick this season isn't a specific win total pulled out of thin air. It's whether the young players are actually getting better week to week, whether the offense is growing more sophisticated and harder to game plan against, whether the team is more competitive in the fourth quarter than it was a year ago. Those are the questions that actually tell you whether a staff is doing its job inside a rebuild, and by every indication coming out of this spring, the answers are trending the right direction. None of that guarantees anything once the games start counting, but it absolutely earns more patience than a one-season ultimatum from people who handed Stefanski years to produce far less. So here's the full picture, laid out plainly, because it's not going to get laid out this clearly anywhere else. An entire media ecosystem spent an offseason building a case against a quarterback who hadn't taken a meaningful snap for the franchise yet. They built it on unverified technical doubts, unnamed leadership concerns, and a steady drumbeat of skepticism that rarely touched actual evidence. Speculation got treated as reporting, personal opinion got dressed up as analysis. And for a stretch of months, it worked, because nobody with real standing pushed back. Then Ramsey spoke. Monken refused to play along. The locker room didn't revolt. Practices looked sharp and organized instead of chaotic. The story started developing cracks that no amount of follow-up commentary could patch over. And instead of pausing to reconsider whether the original premise was ever solid, the response was to simply find a new target. Monken became that target the moment he proved he couldn't be controlled. That's not journalism holding people accountable. That's narrative protection scrambling to survive contact with reality. And the credibility damage from being demonstrably wrong and refusing to admit it doesn't just sit there quietly. It compounds. Every clean rep Shedeur puts together in practice adds weight to the other side of the scale. Every unprompted endorsement from a player with real NFL experience chips away at a story built on second-hand assumptions. Every disciplined, well-run Monken practice session makes the chaos narrative harder to sell with a straight face. The gap between what's being reported and what's actually happening inside that building keeps widening, and it's not closing on its own. The people who built careers on doubting Shedeur Sanders should think carefully about what happens once the season actually starts. Because if he plays anywhere close to the level of a talented quarterback, finally operating inside a system built for him, there won't be anywhere left to redirect the story. No new goalposts to move. No fresh target to substitute in. Just a quarterback answering every question the hard way, on the field, week after week. Todd Monken refused to bury that chance before it ever had the room to breathe, and the panic that decision created among the people counting on a different outcome tells you exactly who was actually fighting for this franchise and who was just protecting a story they'd already written the ending to.